Hello and welcome to the Decade of Centanaries Sligo online lecture series. These talks are illuminating events, people and places from a century ago. My name is Michle Cashman and I am the librarian in the Local Studies section of Sligo Central Library. The materials accompanying these talks are from the Local Studies Library and also from the contributors' collections. We have 6 speakers covering a variety of topics. Dr. Michael Farry's lecture is on the Chaffpool ambush, which took place on the 30th of September 1920. Dr. Padraig Duigan's lecture is on Linda Kearns, her life and times. Local historian and author Joe McGowan will lecture on the Moneygold ambush, which took place in October 1920. I will deliver a talk on behalf of Dr. Reverend Peter C. Humphries on the history of the Sligo Congregational Church 1780 to 1939. This talk will coincide with the forthcoming publication of a pamphlet by Dr. Humphries on the Sligo Congregational Church. Simone Hickey will give a lecture on the Sligo connection to World War I and of some of those soldiers from Sligo who died in the conflict. Tommy Higgins will give a talk on Lest Sligo Forgets, the campaign to commemorate those from Sligo who died in World War I. On behalf of Donald Tinney and Sligo Libraries, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our contributors who took part in the online lecture series under rather challenging circumstances. The story of Sligo Congregational Church from 1780 to 1939. Read on behalf of Dr. Reverend Peter C. Humphries by Michle Cashman. You might wonder why a retired social researcher would have an interest in an old church building in Sligo. Well, a few years ago, my wife and I were enjoying a short break in Sligo. We knew there had been a congregational church here, but where? So we set off to locate it. It wasn't hard to find given its prominent location on Stephen Street. I was even more delighted when we found that it had become the Sligo County Library. The librarian at the time invited me in, and together we explored what we knew of its history. It was, however, rather patchy. When I retired and found that the county librarian, Mr. Donald Tinney, would value a short history on the church to give to inquirers, off I set, and here we have it. The story begins almost 450 years ago. In 1660, a minister of St. John's Church of Ireland was evicted from his post by the authorities because he didn't agree with how the church was being run. Some of the congregation followed, but the independent church they formed doesn't appear to have survived for very long. At this time, many independent ministers and their congregations emigrated to New England and thrived there. They still do. In Ireland, things took a positive turn. In 1780, Andrew Mabon, son of a linen merchant, decided to begin a simple religious service with a few like-minded people. These churches are Protestant in faith, but of the Reformed tradition. They are independent of church hierarchy, and each church governs itself independently, similar to the Quakers. They would have sought to live simply their Christian faith with hymns, prayers, and worship. The efforts of Mr. Mabon bore fruit. Albert Blest, who co-founded the church, was born in Sligo in 1755. He worked hard to keep the new cause going. During the 1798 rebellion, when the major battle of Collooney resulted in the French diverting away from Sligo, Albert Blest rallied and led the remaining 300 males in the town to form barricades to hold up the feared invasion, should it have overcome the regular troops. As we know, this didn't happen. The French headed east instead. The original building for the Congregational Church was called the Union Chapel and was on Harmony Hill. It could hold up to 400 people for worship. It tended to be student pastors that came to minister in Sligo, but none of them stayed very long. It was thought that the remoteness of the location compared to Dublin or Cork was a challenge. However, eventually trained and committed pastors came and made their mark. One such distinguished pastor and speaker was William Urwick. He stayed for 10 years before moving on to Dublin. His memories of his travels to Sligo are both amusing and illuminating. He speaks of first impressions and of how hazardous the journey was. He crossed the Menai Straits to Anglesey by small boat and then a sailing sloop with but scant accommodation in heavy winds to Dublin. This was followed by a 2-day carriage journey over bleak and boggy country to Sligo. He wasn't a man easily discouraged. He was very successful at growing the church in Sligo. His services filled the old chapel, and according to reports, it was crowded to excess. Outreach in the countryside grew, using the Irish language. On William Urwick's departure, there were other good ministers, but particularly the Reverend Noble Shepherd. He had previously ministered at Newry, but remained in Sligo serving the Congregational Church and its community for 40 years. His ministry saw some of the most challenging times in Sligo's history. One of the biggest tasks he undertook was the raising and distributing of monies across Ireland to relieve the suffering during the famine. In the first half of the 19th century, Sligo suffered from pestilence, smallpox, cholera, and famine. Smallpox ravaged the country in 1816, 1817, and 1821. A debilitating pestilence hit in 1822. There had been intermittent potato famines between 1802 and 1821. However, these events were of little preparation for what was to follow, the unfolding tragedy and horror of the Great Famine in Ireland. Sligo suffered on a grand scale. Overall, the population fell by a third between 1841 and 1851, from death due to starvation, illness, and emigration. Over the period 1846 to 1848, a total of £9,500 was raised, almost £1 million in today's money, from congregational churches and other churches throughout the UK for famine relief in Ireland. The funds were sent in and out of the Union Chapel in Sligo to local churches according to greatest need. On a brighter note, in 1850, under the leadership of the Reverend Noble Shepherd, the foundation stone was laid for a new church, a rectory and a schoolroom in Stephen Street. As Sligo slowly recovered from the devastation of the famine, the town began to grow. There were new buildings, markets and more commerce. The new Congregational Church, prominently placed on a major road in town, signified a commitment by the Reverend Noble Shepherd to Sligo and its future. Voluntary church workers were essential for keeping the fellowship going and for the administration of the church. Between 1864 and 1910, 12 weddings took place, as recorded in the marriage register. The baptismal register, 1852 to 1906, records 90 baptisms in the church. At this time, there was a tendency of pastors to come and go, but William Hall served the community well and in challenging times. During his ministry, the church experienced hostile attacks and rowdy mobs with which the local constabulary were slow to react. Such a mob attacked the church building with stones that broke windows, damaged the organ within, as well as houses of the members of the congregation. From the late 1870s, there was recorded evidence of hostilities towards non-Catholic churches and their people. The last permanent pastor was the Reverend Gordon McLachlan, who served the church well and with great devotion for 18 years until his return to Scotland in 1922. Records of the members' emigration to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and the USA continued to reduce the membership. There was a belief at the time that all Protestants were rich and came from the landed gentry. However, the members of the Sligo Congregational Church came from a range of backgrounds. The 1911 census shows some interesting detail. Church members included farmers, drapers and grocers' assistants, a dressmaker, bakers and confectioners, commercial clerks, solicitors' clerks, school teachers, clerk of petty sessions, a postmistress, a surgeon and apothecary, an income tax surveyor, a brick burner, a master bookbinder, an umbrella maker, a draper's merchant, a customs officer, a nurse, and domestic servants. Many of these came from England and Scotland, but some were local, sometimes travelling for worship from Ballincar, Coolani, and Tubbercurry. After World War I, the War of Independence, the Civil War, and the establishment of the Free State, many members departed who may have otherwise stayed. Slowly the services diminished and the church closed in 1939. However, the building itself survived and was given a new lease of life. Sligo County Council was looking for a building to house the Sligo County Library. The previous home of the library had outgrown the library collection and was unable to meet the needs of a growing population of library users. In 1940, initial inquiries were made by the council as to the possibilities of renting or purchasing the property. 6 years later, the building came onto the market and was purchased by a local property syndicate, much to the disappointment of the council. However, they were unable to get planning permission for their proposed building. Sligo County Council then purchased the building and the library moved into the church in 1952. The adjacent manse was converted into Sligo County Museum in 1955. All that I would like to say in conclusion is perhaps now, as you pass by or come in to use the library for some of its many services, do spare a thought for those that have gone before, and especially for those who worshipped here for all those years. I like to think that the Reverend Noble Shepherd, who was an early pioneer and library campaigner, would have been pleased that the church is still a community building, where all are welcome and all can find joy, passion, and intellectual fulfillment amongst its shelves.